you can kind of break down the book of Hebrews into some sections, and 1 through 4 tends to deal with kind of the law and the mediation by angels, and then Moses and the promised land, and then 5 through 10 has to do more with the priesthood, Melchizedek, the sacrifices, atonement, those kinds of things. What's the thrust of the argument from the writer of the book of Hebrews about how is the new covenant better in those terms of priesthood and sacrifice and those kinds of things?
So it talks about Jesus being a better high priest than the old priesthood. It talks about the old priests, also having to sacrifice not just for the people but for themselves, for they themselves were sinners. But in Jesus, the ultimate high priest, he's not a sinner, and his sacrifice is not for himself. It is only for the sinners. So that's where it starts, as far as Jesus being a better high priest, but also Jesus a better sacrifice, and that the blood of bulls and goats, they had to do this, continually, and then on the Day of Atonement every year, but Jesus' sacrifice is once and for all.
Yeah, and so again, I think for a modern reader, they would say something like, "Okay, well that's neat," but I don't know that we really catch on to the depth of the argument with this. Why is it important? I can see somebody saying, "Hey, you know what? A priest is a priest. Who cares?" I don't understand why I need a priest who doesn't need to sacrifice for his own sins. I don't understand why Jesus. Okay, so he's sinless, but why? What does that mean to me? What's the deal?
It's one of those things that you start getting into nitty gritty, and you really got to go back to Genesis, and we got to talk about Adam, and Adam as the federal head of humanity fell, and now we need a federal head who's going to redeem humanity, and to be able to do that, he can't be having to redeem himself as well, and so we need a perfect, sinless sacrifice who can act as the new federal head, the new Adam, if you will.
Okay, and so when you say federal head, what are we supposed to take from that? Like, why is it important that Jesus is sinless as far as his representation of us to the Father?
We talk in the New Testament about being clothed in Christ, and only perfection can exist in the presence of the Father. And so Jesus, being perfect, can exist in the presence of the Father. But as sinless creatures, apart from some pathway being made for it, we could not. But being clothed in Christ, who was perfect, we are looked upon as perfect, being found in him, and now can exist in God's presence. But apart from that, it's impossible.
Yeah, I think that this argument is a really powerful argument, but I think for us as modern readers, it's often lost on us that everything really hinges on this. God obviously can't tolerate a lack of perfection. For him to do so would be for him to no longer be God. Imagine a world-renowned chef who makes a terrible meal. His identity is lost in that, and I think that if you watch Gordon Ramsay or any of those other chefs, and you watch shows like Hell's Kitchen where he's trying to train chefs, one of the things that he sits there at what they call the pass, and he's the person who looks at, examines, tastes the food before it goes out to the customers. And because it's his name on the restaurant, and so he's got chefs working for him, but he's that guy who stands there at the pass, and if he were to let out bad food, he would no longer be who he is. And there's a sense in which that's exactly the situation, that God is not God if he allows his image to exist in a way that demeans him, that profanes him. And I think that it's really lost on us that Jesus is that person who stands in front of us and represents us and has that perfection. And so without him, everything hinges on this. And really that's the argument here. And so then, we get on to the idea of the sacrifice. And, I think that's also something that as modern people, because obviously who among us has engaged in going and making a sacrifice at a temple. We're kind of lost on why this is important. So what's the significance here?
So I think you're right. One, it starts with not having a lofty enough view of God. I think maybe we think of him as grandpa, and we sin, and he's just like, it's okay. And that's not the attitude of God at all. But, once we understand how seriously he takes this, then I think the need for a sacrifice arises naturally. But, it's funny, I think in 2020 hindsight, we can look at the Old Testament and be like, okay, so there were these substitutionary sacrifices, and somehow, the blood of bulls and goats and lambs and stuff like that could somehow atone for a person. And maybe now as a Christian we think, was it foolish to ever believe this? And the book of Hebrews says, it actually never did, but it was kind of pointing towards, and it kind of laid a framework for which the value of the sacrifice could be understood. But, to atone for the body of sin of mankind, past, present, future, a sacrifice that is great enough to atone for all of that, to overcome, to cover all of that. And in Jesus, we have a sacrifice of infinite worth, of infinite value, and infinitely greater, being the Son of God.
What do we, when we talk about atonement, I think that again, for modern readers, we don't really know what we mean by that. Somehow, how does Jesus dying make up for these sins? And so we're not familiar with things like atonement or things like propitiation. These really theological terms are lost on us. And so why exactly is a sacrifice necessary? What exactly does it do for us?
So in this case, you brought up that word propitiation. It's satisfying the wrath of. If somebody were to harm my child, you can rest assured that my initial immediate emotional response would probably involve a fair amount of wrath. And the question is, if my child has been harmed, how do you appease that? And sincere apology, and maybe that's enough in some cases, but depending on the degree of harm, it may require something more. And it's not a great perfect analogy here, but it's something that needs to appease the wrath of God. We often don't take sin seriously enough, so I think maybe we're struggling to understand why this is necessary as well.
Right. I think that's where we often kind of lose the plot on this, is that we don't like the idea of propitiation. It's kind of fallen out of favor even amongst some theologians, but really there doesn't seem to be a way back from sin unless there is a recognition of the devaluing that's taken place. The wrath comes from the devaluing, and something has to make up for that value.